Today we're going to talk about World War II. So if you would like to follow along, just download the World War II PowerPoint. Okay, so according to the military historian John Keegan, World War II was the largest single event in human history, fought across 6 of the world's 7 continents and all of its oceans. It killed 50 million human beings, left hundreds of millions of others wounded in mind or body, and materially devastated much of the heartland of civilization. You're kind of going to watch some documentaries leading up to the war, so I'm just going to talk about the war itself. The United States gets involved on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Congress declares war. The House votes 388 to 1 to declare war. There was one lone vote. Janet Rankin of Montana, she also voted against World War I when she was in Congress during World War I. The Senate votes unanimously to go to war. World War II ends, the New Deal. FDR says Dr. Win the War has replaced Dr. New Deal. So the New Deal's over, and he's going to be focused on the war effort. Pearl Harbor killed about 2,500 people, 8 battleships damaged, 3 destroyers, 160 some aircraft destroyed. It's basically a 6-month setback for the United States in the Pacific theater. The most important ships, the aircraft carriers, are not at Pearl Harbor that day, so the aircraft carriers escaped destruction by the Japanese attack. America mobilizes for war. They pass the War Powers Act, which gives FDR authority over all aspects of the war. Some historians start to see this as the start of the imperial presidency, meaning the president has executive power and does a lot of things Congress used to do. Defense building skyrockets. 15 million Americans serve in the military. 700,000 blacks will serve. They're still segregated, and they face much of the same discrimination that they did during World War I. After World War II, we'll start to see the kind of modern era of civil rights. The military will be desegregated, and that process will begin after World War II. A lot of historians, but not all of them, see World War II as what actually ended the Great Depression. You can see how the gross national product shoots up from before the war till after the war. It more than doubles. By the middle of the war, 2/3 of the economy is involved in the war effort. Taxes, the Revenue Act, loans pay for the war, basically. The War Production Board is something that kind of guides the economy. It's run by Donald Nelson. He's he's from Sears Roebuck Company. The War Production Board awards defense contracts, allocates resources, gets businesses to convert their factories to war production. So big business and government work hand in hand to make the materials, the tanks, the airplanes, the guns, the bombs necessary to win the war. American industry gets behind the war effort. The Ford Motor Company quits making cars and starts making planes. They make 8,000 B-24 Liberators. American industrial production doubles that of the Axis powers combined. Stalin famously said, "To American production, without which the war would have been lost." So even Stalin realizes that American industry won the war. American industry produces over 85,000 tanks, almost 300,000 airplanes, 15 million rifles, 64,000 landing craft. The workers and the unions pledge a no strike for the duration of the war, so they won't go on strike. Union membership goes up. Basically, everybody does well during World War II as far as making money. So World War II is good for business and labor. If you want to watch the video on slide 11, this is kind of a cool video. There was something called the Liberty ships. They were built by Henry Kaiser. And basically, he could build a ship in a number of days by basically like building it in parts and then putting it all together. And this video kind of shows how he does it. It's pretty interesting. Women go into the factories. They contribute to the war effort by working. There is a women's army corps. They work as in the Navy as nurses, 36% of the labor force is women. They work in factories, so they have all kinds of jobs. They also fly airplanes from one place to another, so they can't fly in combat, obviously, but what they do is they'll ferry the planes from one place to another. Um, Blacks make some civil rights gains during World War II. A. Philip Randolph, um, he plans a march on Washington in 1941. This is right before the war breaks out. But basically, Roosevelt kind of does something that stops the march, but also kind of gives blacks a little bit of civil rights. He doesn't support civil rights generally, but he issues an executive order, 8802, and it basically bans discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries. So basically, blacks are not going to get discriminated against when they're working in defense industries. He establishes the Fair Employment Practices Commission to enforce anti-discrimination policies. Now, one of the things FDR does do that's kind of a stain on his presidency is he inters Japanese Americans in internment camps. He does this through an executive order. Over 100,000 Japanese are placed in internment camps. These are Japanese from the West Coast. They're placed in camps in California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Arkansas. Some are allowed out of the camps to serve in the military, to work as farm laborers, or to go to college. The interesting thing is the Japanese in Hawaii are never interred. There are a couple Supreme Court cases that deal with this, but they end up ruling that it's constitutional. It's kind of an emergency time, and they say that the government can do this. After the war, not after the war, when the war is kind of getting to the end in 1944, 1945 is when it officially ends, FDR signs the GI Bill of Rights, provides education and job training, medical care, pensions, mortgage loans, $4 billion to 9 million veterans. So FDR helps take care of the veterans so when they come home, they have something they can do. Hollywood gets involved in the war effort. Frank Capra was a famous movie director. He did It's a Wonderful Life. He does a series of of propaganda documentaries, I guess you could call them, called Why We Fight. They're actually really good if you'd like to watch them. Hollywood supports the war effort. Hollywood makes pro-war movies. Hollywood does skits where they mock the dictators. So Hollywood gets behind the effort. A lot of movie stars sign up and go fight. There is rationing, just like there was kind of in World War I. You have something called the Office of Price Administration. They ration food, gas, rubber, shoes. Americans grow victory gardens. So a lot of the same things that happened in World War I happen in World War II. FDR runs for re-election in 1940. He runs against Thomas Dewey. You can see that FDR still wins pretty handily, but he's not winning by as much. This is his third and fourth terms he's going to run for, and basically people start to realize maybe we don't want a president around here quite as much. So I'm sorry, he ran against Wendell Willkie in 1940, and then 1944 he runs against Thomas Dewey. So I've got the four electoral college maps on slide 27. You can kind of see. I forgot I talked about defeating Willkie earlier. His last term as president, he picks Harry Truman to be his vice president. That's going to be important because FDR is going to die in 1945, so Harry Truman will become president. Okay, so when the war starts for America, America has to make a choice. Do we want to fight in Europe first, or mainly have our focus there, or do we want to fight in the Pacific? Remember, Hitler and Mussolini declare war on America, but it's actually Japan that attacks America. But because Stalin, Churchill, and FDR see Hitler as the bigger threat, they decide on a Europe first strategy, and then they'll kind of mop things up in the Pacific later on. Germany advanced against Moscow, but they were stopped on the outskirts. Germany advances in the Ukraine and the Caucasus. There's some huge battles in the east. The Battle of Stalingrad is one of the most famous battles of World War II. It's kind of seen as the turning point of the war in the east. The Russians have a victory against the German Sixth Army. They take over 300,000 German prisoners of war. Stalin constantly wants a second front opened up in Europe. He wants the Allies, England and America, to invade through France. But basically, what ends up happening is America and Britain don't invade Europe proper. They kind of make strides towards that. The first place the Allies invade is North Africa. This is Operation Torch. So in 1942, the Americans and the British invade North Africa because the Germans and the Italians had bases in North Africa. So there's fighting in North Africa. Later on, after the Allies win in North Africa, they invade Sicily in July of 1943, and then they invade Italy in September of 1943. So basically, after the Allies are victorious in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, they're finally ready to open a second front against Hitler in Western Europe. And basically, Stalin starts to not trust the West, England, and America. He thinks to himself, the Americans and English are intentionally not opening a second front so that I have to bear the full brunt against Hitler. They don't like me because I'm communist, so they want me and Hitler to kill ourselves off, and then they'll swoop in at the last minute and kind of finish up the job. So Harry Truman said that earlier, but Stalin doesn't trust the West. After the Americans invade Italy, Mussolini is killed by communist partisans. I've got a picture of him being hung on slide 34. He's executed, and then his body is put on display. The big invasion comes in June of 1944. That's when the Americans, the British, and their allies like the Canadians invade France. So this is the start of the Second Front. It's called Operation Overlord, or it's also referred to as D-Day. But basically what happens is the Americans and the British invade Normandy, France, and they open up a second front. They establish a beachhead, and then they invade France. They liberate Paris in August of 1944. By September of 1944, the Germans are driven out of the rest of France and Belgium. The Germans try one last offensive against the Americans and the British during Christmas of 1944. This is called the Battle of the Bulge. Basically, what happened was they made one last effort to break through the American lines. The American lines and the British lines, they bulge. If you look at slide 38, you can see how the Germans almost broke through, but after the bulge expanded, the Americans and the British got things back together and reinforced their lines. As the Americans and the British are liberating Europe, they witness the Holocaust. They start liberating concentration camps, and they stumble upon these things. Hitler killed 6 million Jews and 6 million more Poles, Gypsies, Slavs, other people he considered undesirable. The Nazis photographed their atrocities at concentration camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau, and Auschwitz. And the Americans stumble upon this, and they photograph this and document it so that they have proof of what the Nazis did later on. FDR, Churchill, and Stalin meet at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. They know that the war is going to go their way, so they start thinking, how are we going to kind of organize the post-war world? So they start to talk about spheres of influence. They divide up Eastern Europe. They divide Germany. They divide Berlin. Stalin agrees that he will go attack Japan after Germany surrenders. They make plans to create the United Nations. Later on in April, the United Nations is founded. There's a Security Council with 5 permanent members: America, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. There's 6 other nations on the Security Council that go on a rotating basis. The 5 permanent members have a veto over each other and over the General Assembly. By March of 1945, the Allies have reached the Rhine River, so they're starting to invade Germany. The siege of Berlin happens in April and May of 1945, so the Russians get to Berlin first. It's 300,000 Germans versus 3 million Russians. Hitler kind of hides out in Berlin while this is going on. He celebrates his last birthday. Towards the end of April, the Russians begin their final assault. It's a huge, massive attack. Hitler is still hiding out in his bunker. He marries his mistress, Eva Braun. He ends up committing suicide with her. About 125,000 Germans died in this last siege of Berlin. Over 300,000 Russians died. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signs the final surrender on May 8th. So May 8th is seen as Victory in Europe Day. Now, FDR died in April of 1945, so he dies before he can see the surrender of the Axis powers. He dies in Warm Springs, Georgia, of a cerebral hemorrhage. So he didn't get to live to see the surrender. Harry Truman becomes president. So that's kind of the war in Europe. I know that's really quick, but now I'm going to shift to the war in the Pacific. So I'm on slide 55. So Japan had been steadily advancing into the Pacific. They basically wanted to use the Pacific as their defense corridor. So all those islands in the Pacific would protect Japan, the home islands. After Pearl Harbor, America retaliated with the Doolittle raid. If you've ever seen the movie Pearl Harbor, that's kind of the end of the movie, is the Doolittle raid. But they bombed Tokyo in April 1942 just to show Japan that they can be hit. They want to bring the war to Japan, so they sent aircraft carriers as close as they could to Japan, and then bombers took off from these aircraft carriers and bombed Japan. Later on, you have the Battle of Midway, which is kind of seen as a big battle in the Pacific. We'll talk about that. The Japanese invade the Philippines and kick out the Americans. So Douglas MacArthur gets kicked out of the Philippines. You have the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Basically, those are the farthest the Japanese advanced. So the Coral Sea kind of saved Australia from being invaded because Japan was maybe thinking about that. And then the Battle of Midway, if you look at slide 61, basically, if the Japanese could get Midway, they could take over Hawaii, and basically they could control the whole Pacific Ocean. So, America's goal is eventually to invade Japan using the islands in the Pacific. If the Japanese control all the islands in the Pacific, America would have to invade Japan from the United States, and the Pacific Ocean is just too big to do that from. So basically, the Americans stop the Japanese advance at Midway, and then they start island hopping towards Japan. So they take this island, maybe they don't need to take this one, so they'll skip over it, they'll hop over it, and they're just slowly making their way towards the mainland. There's all kinds of just terrible, ferocious fighting in the Pacific. A lot of times the Japanese will do suicide, charges at the end of a battle or in the middle of the night. When they know they're defeated, all their men will just rush the lines to commit suicide, kill as many Americans as possible. I've got some YouTube clips that show this. If you look at slide 64, sometimes the Japanese commit mass suicide when the Americans win, so civilians and soldiers just kill themselves. If you click on the video on slide 65, it's got footage from Saipan. This video is really graphic. It shows Japanese jumping off cliffs, killing themselves by throwing them on the rocks below or jumping out to sea. Sometimes they blow themselves up with grenades or just walk out into the ocean to drown. But after the Americans win at Saipan and Guam, they get to build air bases from which their bombers can take off and bomb Japan. The Philippines is soon retaken. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, it's one of the biggest battles of the war as far as ocean battles. Not just one of the biggest, it is the biggest battle. After that, MacArthur returns to the Philippines. MacArthur is kind of seen as the hero of the Pacific. He'll be important later on when we talk about the Korean War. There's kind of two big last battles in the Pacific Ocean, the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So February and March 1945 is Iwo Jima, and then April to June 1945 is Okinawa, and then you kind of have the end of the war in August and September of 1945. But basically, these are just more islands that the Americans have to invade so that they can get to the mainland Japan. There's all kinds of just terrible battle scenes. On Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. On Iwo Jima, there's a mountain called Mount Suribachi, and the Japanese are hidden inside of it. And after the fighting is over, they kind of come out and do a, kind of a suicide charge. Um, if you look at slide 78, there's a movie clip that kind of shows what this battle would have been like. There's a lot of heroes in the Pacific. If you look at slide 81, there's kind of this interesting story about this soldier named Tony Stein. He wins the Medal of Honor. What he would do and what others would do is they would create these machine guns called the Stinger. Basically, they would go find fighter planes that had crashed, and they would get their 50 caliber guns, and they would take them off the plane, and they would put like a bar rifle's butt up against the 50 caliber. So they would basically create this kind of like Frankenstein gun, and these were belt-fed guns that were supposed to be on airplanes, and they would just run around on the beaches machine gunning pillboxes with these huge machine guns that are supposed to go on fighter planes. So it's kind of interesting story. I've got an article there if you'd like to read more about him. Like I said, there's kind of a last-ditch effort by the Japanese on Iwo Jima. The famous picture of the Americans raising the flag is there. Now, after Iwo Jima, you have the Battle of Okinawa, and these are basically, like I said, trying to get these islands conquered so that we can invade the homelands. I'll let you kind of read through some of those battles. The little battles aren't necessarily what I'm wanting you to learn. It's just more the island hopping method. At Okinawa, you have these crazy kamikaze attacks. If you're on slide 100, I've got a YouTube clip you can watch. More ships and more men are killed and sunk here than at Pearl Harbor. More than 5,000 men are killed. Basically, the Japanese realize that they're losing the war, so they just start to do suicide attacks where they put enough fuel for a one-way flight, and they crash their planes into any ship they can. So eventually, the Americans capture Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But what ends up happening, and this is kind of the important significance of these battles, the Americans realize that the Japanese are going to fight to the last man on Japan. So when the home islands are invaded, you'll probably have to fight the whole army, and you might have to fight the entire citizenry of Japan. And if you don't have to fight them, they might all kill themselves, or a large number of them. Somebody suggests that it's going to take 1 million men dying or being injured to conquer Japan. So President Truman realizes, I can't sacrifice that many Americans just to conquer Japan while I have the atomic bomb. So what ends up happening is Truman's going to use the atomic bombs later. Before the atomic bombs are dropped, Tokyo was firebombed in March of 1945. Almost 90,000 people are killed. More people would be killed directly in this firebombing than the atomic bombs being dropped. Most people don't realize that. They think the atomic bombs killed the most people. But initially, the firebombings kill more people. I've got some pictures there of Tokyo in the aftermath. It does look like an atomic bomb went off, but those are just fire bombs that burn the city. And eventually what ends up happening is, like I said, Truman realizes he has to drop the atomic bomb. Now, Truman didn't even know the atomic bomb was being built. He finds out about it after he becomes president. FDR kept the atomic bomb secret from Truman, from Congress, from the American people. And this Manhattan Project is the effort to build the atomic bomb. And what ends up happening is Truman decides to use it. And this is also kind of interesting. Stalin knew about the atomic bomb before Truman did. There's a lot of communist spies in FDR's administration in the Manhattan Project. So these communist spies are secretly giving the Soviets updates on the American bomb. They sneak plans to the Soviets. So at Potsdam, which is a conference that the military leaders take part in. So the military leaders, the civilian leaders, Truman and Stalin meet, and Truman says, hey, I've got this weapon that's going to end the war, and Stalin says, I hope you use it. So on August 6th and August 9th, the Americans drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, hundreds of thousands of people killed or injured. But it does force Japan to surrender. After the atomic bombs are dropped, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. So Japan is facing the atomic bombs, the American invasion force, the Soviet Union's army. Japan knows that the gig is over. So in September of 1945, they surrender aboard the USS Missouri. If you want to watch some newsreel footage on slides 123, you can. Um, so World War II was just total bloodshed, 15 million battle deaths, 45 million civilian deaths. Some people think that China may have lost 50 million civilians. Nobody really knows how many people died in China. 27 million Russians died in World War II, soldiers and civilians. So World War II totally devastates Russia, but we'll talk more of that once we get into the Cold War.